Hello, everyone, and welcome to another lecture for international reporting. I'm Professor Harper, and we turn to the Middle East this week, a complicated place. I spent a number of years there as a reporter. I started as the bureau chief for Newsweek magazine in Beirut, and then served as the bureau chief for ABC News in Cairo. And then when I was in Rome, I spent a lot of time going back and forth, primarily to the Arab world. Although the Middle East has kind of expanded since the time when I was there up until going there until the 1990s. We used to think of the Middle East as primarily Israel and then the Arab world. That's kind of expanded to a certain extent to include Iran, which is not an Arab country, and also Turkey, which is not an Arab country. So we'll include Turkey and Iran along with Israel and the Arab world in this definition, in this conversation. I like maps, and we'll use maps as we go through this course. And so I'll start with 7 maps that explain the Middle East. So first of all, you look at the Middle East and you see Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Yemen, and then into Iran, as I say, which is not an Arab country, and then Turkey, which also is not. We used to include Northern Africa as kind of part of all of this because Libya, Algeria, Morocco are Arab countries, even though they're in Africa. So it's important to kind of focus on this map. And so we'll look at other ones. So, the map's easy, but the region is far more complex than its borders. And for the most part, the borders are movable, if you will, and have been for years. So the Middle East is the Arab core of the Muslim world, but thinking about the region as exclusively Arab excludes Turkey, Iran, and a very large Kurdish population across several countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. So it does, if you look at it only as a Muslim area or a Jewish state of Israel, it excludes the Jews, Christians, Yazidis, Zoroastrians, Baha'i, and other religious groups in the region. The idea of the Middle East has become quite vague, but in our view, it's where perhaps the most complex war is raging. So let's take a look. Most people tend to think of the Middle East as deserts, and there are a lot of deserts, but the population can't really exist on most of those deserts, although the Bedouins do. The Middle East has got a lot of mountain ranges, and that accounts for a great number of the places where people live, so that if you look, for example, in Kuwait, mountainous region here, Iraq, mountainous region and concentration, also Lebanon, well known for its mountains, Israel, and then the Nile River. So the mountainous terrain is typically less populated than the lowlands due to obvious factors such as the ease of making a living, but that's true in most places. The lowlands lack the water and offer a less hospitable life in the Middle East. And so as a result, most of the population centers in the mountains of Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. So looking again, this is by religion. So Sunni is the light green. Sunni is the dominant part of Islam, the largest. About 90% of all Muslims are Sunni. Shia, the largest concentration is in Iran. Okay, but there are also large concentrations in Kuwait and Iraq, and to a certain extent, in Syria and in Lebanon. Okay. So religious divisions are particularly important for understanding the Middle East. There is a division between Sunnis and Shias. They have a different structure in terms of the number of times that they pray, in terms of their belief system. Although they both believe in Allah, the succession after the death of Muhammad split into Sunnis and to Shia. Christians and Jews clearly have different understandings, although the underpinning for both Christianity and Judaism in the Old Testament is roughly the same. But there are many religious factions here, and you have to go beyond those religious factions as political factions as well. So in terms of a variety of ethnic groups, okay, the Arabs are predominant, okay, with the light green. The Alawites, which is, they are the rulers of Syria currently and have been for a number of years, are a subset of Shia, and here is the Alawites, okay. The Kurds, who became allies of the United States in Iraq and in Syria during the Civil War, are scattered throughout the region, here in Lebanon, Syria, also in Iraq, and also some in Iran. But as you can see, there are a number of different groups as well. The Druze are primarily in Lebanon, but also exist in Israel. Armenians were driven out of Turkey, great massacres in the early 20th century. They are scattered throughout the Middle East, so that there are a variety of different groups that exist throughout the Middle East. Here, for example, the Kurds are largely Sunni Muslims, but they are hostile to the Arab Sunnis and to the Shia. The Druze are neither Muslim nor Christian, but can find themselves allied with either side. To understand the origins of the ethnic complexity, you need to go back to the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turkish-based empire, which lasted for several hundred years until after the First World War. So this is what the Ottoman Empire looked like. It was in Turkey, but also spread into parts of Europe, down into what we now consider Syria, into Lebanon, what we now consider Lebanon, also into what we now consider Israel and into Egypt, and also across into what we now consider Iraq and down along the border with Iran. So the Ottomans dominated the region for centuries. They were a Turkic community. The Arabs mostly hated them. The Christians in Europe were afraid of them, but they were a very dominant group during that time. They didn't use force for the most part to impose their religion on conquered nations, but they did create political subdivisions that put most of their people in charge, and over time they did create a great deal of resentment. After World War I, the Ottomans were very weak going into World War I. They aligned with the Germans during World War I, Austro-Hungarian technically, and after they fell, it left kind of a jumble in the Middle Eastern area. So each group had the strength to survive in the Middle East, but lacked capability to conquer the others. So there was a great deal of subdivision and differences that occurred. So the mountainous terrain also gave an advantage to the defender and made it difficult for other conquerors to take full power. The result has been inherent instability in the region for roughly 100 years. So after World War I, the Europeans divided the Middle East into essentially two power centers, the British and the French. So the British took control of Iraq, what we now consider Iraq, Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Israel, which is what is now Israel, Palestine back then. The French took control of Lebanon and Syria, and there were great influences by the British in Egypt, for example, and in Saudi Arabia. So after World War I, the victorious powers divided the Middle East into entities that had never existed before. The French took the northwest and consolidated into one large state, Syria, and the British basically took control of Jordan and Iraq. What is most important is to understand how artificial these entities are. And these borders continue, for the most part, today. And they really don't take into account the various ethnic groups that the borders simply, cut aside. So the point is that there is nothing natural about the boundaries in the Middle East. Some of the states were created on a more solid foundation than others, but they were all invented over the last century. That's it for now, and thanks very much. We'll see you online.